Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there simplifying her complexity is the indomitable, uber complex Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick it off, just a few ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure that your camera and microphone are turned off. After Dave's talks, we'll have a question and answer period, followed hopefully by a nice conversation with all of you. Should you have a question or comment, you can either raise your Zoom hand or send your question directly to Barbara via the chat with a big Q in front, and she will probably just ask you to read it out for yourself. The recording will be posted to Vimeo on our Complexity Lounge page in the next few days, and that is where you will find all of our past videos from the lounge. Today, we welcome Dave Snowden to help us wrap up our second year of the Complexity Lounge. Dave is founder and chief scientific officer at the Cynefin Company, and the founder and director of the Center for Applied Complexity at the University of Wales. Today, Dave will be discussing his latest thoughts on a number of topics, and rather than summarize them, I think I'll just hand it over to you, Dave. So Dave, welcome to the lounge.
Okay, it's always nice to be back. And some of you are at the Wet Event in Washington would have heard quite a lot of this anyway, right? So this is kind of like an update and a putting together. Just to set the context on this, the thing we've been working on as a group for about 15, 20 years now is not just to understand complexity in human systems, but I think that's a distinct school, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but also to try and find a way in which we can hang together a coherent story that will work at sea level in organizations. And it's easy to do one or the other, but it's actually quite difficult to do both. And what started to come together, we had a retreat up in the swimming pool up in New York State, which I strongly recommend to people. So that was Mary Boone, myself, and Ellie, where we worked on the book. And if anybody wants to see the book chapter structure, that's going to be on our haunt in about tomorrow. Yeah, and we're setting up discussion on that. So we were starting to put things together. And really, it was only after Estuarine Mapping came out that everything did start to hang together enough that I felt confident the book would work. So this is a reflection on that, yeah? And there are inevitably some compromises in what I'm going to talk about. So my plan is to talk through two of the key components before I get onto the sort of big picture stuff. One is the use of assemblage theory. The other is affordance mapping, also known as Estuarine Mapping. And I want to make those two distinct things, and I'll put them together in a minute. Yeah. We've also been working heavily, and this will come through in about 20 minutes' time, into how do you explain complexity to C-level executives so they feel they can do something about it. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean everybody. It means the 13.5% to 15% of people who do new things. Yeah, not the bulk of people who wait for everybody else to have done it a few times. So I want to make it clear. But we're now out of the sort of very early enthusiast stage, which is 2.5% of the market. We're into the early adopter phase, which is actually 13% on average. And the big switch between those stages is people go from kind of like, how do you do this? What's the theory behind it? That's the 2.5%. And they're a right bloody pain, to be honest. Yeah. Because they always think they know more than you do. The 13.5% actually, what will it do for me? Right? So that's the point where you've got credibility. So this is a mixture of those. And I'm going to talk as I go through this of some of the new research projects we're setting up next year, particularly around distributed decision making. Yeah, so I'll briefly outline that. Yeah. So that's the kind of like overall context on this. I'm not going to share screen, but I did let Barbara have some slides earlier. So you're welcome to have those, and I'll reference them as we go through, but I really want to see faces, right? So there's some background on that. Yeah. So let's go through a few things. First of all, as a lot of you know, for the last 20, 30 years, we've been working very heavily on narrative-based research, right? And that came out of the original DARPA work and out of our original work on knowledge management, where we're trying to identify how people make decisions, and the best way to find decisions was to actually go to stories. So we came into narrative not from the perspective of communication, although we did develop into that, but from the area of research in terms of how we do things. So that was the research background on that. And we were also working in DARPA. So when we initially started this, and this was myself, Cynthia, the two Robs, there were about 8 or 9 of us involved, yeah? One of the things we were looking at then is fairly crude interpretations of stories. But we knew 2 things for definitive. One is we wanted to gather material at scale. And secondly, we wanted to give people the power to do their own interpretation. Right? That was coming from an ethnographic background, which was key on this. And as some of you know, I pioneered ethnography in organizations by literally going and working in organizations for 2 or 3 weeks at a time as an apprentice. That was IBM. And that method actually found far more knowledge and far more information than interviews or workshops or anything else. I mean, literally getting your hands dirty, or in one case, being up to your neck in sewage, kind of like gives you a sort of taste of reality, yeah, and a sort of credibility with the people who are doing things. So there was that ethnographic aspect. Yeah. Now that comes into a body of literature which is focused on what's called epistemic injustice and epistemic sovereignty. So we sort of intuited it about 25, 30 years ago that people had the right to interpret their own story. Over the last 15 years, a very strong strand has emerged in the feminist literature, which said interpretation is key. Beth, who was involved in this, has a famous way of explaining epistemic injustice, which I love. She says, you know, old men are philosophers, old wives tell tales. And if you just look at the syntax of that, that explains epistemic injustice. Yeah? I'd also argue, and I'll just throw the first major controversy in at the moment, that people like Peter Senge and Otto Scharmiger and nearly all the metamodernists, yeah, are fundamentally focused on a specific cultural imposition on society. It's a sort of white male liberal post-Enlightenment model of decision-making and rationality, which they feel everybody else should adopt. And having done a lot of work in indigenous and other communities, we sort of rejected that stuff from day one. Yeah. So that was when SenseMaker started to emerge. It didn't really emerge till after I left IBM. And that was when we got into triad-based indexing. And that got us into a couple of key concepts. One is abductive research, and the other is high abstraction. All right, so abduction is going to be key on this. So traditional approach on this, deduction if A then B, induction, all the cases of A have B, so I can assume some linkages. Yeah, abduction is also, it comes from the American pragmatists, also from Bateson with a different approach, from us with a different approach, but all sitting together, is what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things, otherwise known as the logic of hunches. And it turns out human beings are really good at this. The downside is it makes us very prone to conspiracy theories. So there's an upside and a downside. And that also got us into the concept of abstraction. Yeah. And abstraction, art and music come before significant development of language in human evolution, which isn't the case in other mammals. Yeah. May or may not be the case in octopi. There's a sort of issue on that, on symbolic intelligence. But for human beings, art is fundamental, because what abstraction does is it takes you away from the material, so you're more likely to see a novel connection. Yeah, I've got some of my best ideas looking at Caravaggio or in the opera. Yeah, what music does is it creates that separation between the material and the abstract. And if you look at various pieces of work that, you know, Deakin's first book before his second book, which ripped off Alicia and others, yeah, his first book, which was very good, on symbolic species, fundamentally identified that symbolism is key. He was the one who finally disproved Chomsky's theory of language. Yeah, that we're not an intelligent camera. We're not, language doesn't symbolize specific meaning. It's far more complex than that. Yeah. So I'm rambling around on this a bit, but I want to explain some of the background. So abstraction and abduction were key. And that was when we moved into triad-based indexing. So we have all positive indexes. Yeah, so nobody can say anything negative, and nobody can work out what the right answer is. And that's the fundamental principle behind SenseMaker. I'll talk through some more applications of that later. But the other thing that heavily part of the IBM work was the work of Manuel Delanda, really from his early days. So we picked up on his 1000 book, quite early on. And one of the great things Delanda did was to translate Deleuze and Guattari for an American audience. He more or less did that by stripping out the Marxism of Guattari and leaving it with Deleuzian epistemology. And I'm in trouble with some members of my team who think that Delanda destroyed the romanticism of Deleuze, all right? But I've got a background in physics. I prefer Deleuze without Guattari, if I'm honest, all right? So that was when we started to look at assemblage theory, and then we started to look at territorialization and deterritorialization, and those are going to be key phrases as I go forward. So assemblage theory, and I'm going to make it very crude at the moment. And the upfront thing to say in the first slide I put up actually says this distinctly. People confuse assemblage with assembly. All right, an assembly isn't an assemblage. I've given you a quote there from an article by Anna Anelli. So the Snowden in that quote is not me. That's my daughter, whose thesis is on Deleuze. And it's a key thing. It translates as ajustement. My French is hopeless, all right? But it's a heterogeneous coexistence. It's a continuous aspect of change. So it's not a specific assembly at time. It's something which is fluidly changing, but with coherence. So it's very like a strange attractor in complexity theory. If you look at the Lorentz butterfly, nothing ever follows the same pathway, but there's a pattern in all of the pathways which you can identify. All right. So we started to say, okay, so we've got a commonality now between an assemblage, a trope, and a strange attractor. And we can represent that. And that was when we started to get into landscape diagrams. And I put one of those up to give an illustration, which is a probability distribution. And this comes into one of the key lessons I want to talk about on complexity. Complexity is not about causality, it's about patterns. Therefore, if we want to look at things like culture, we don't represent it on a spider diagram, with a series of apparently causal factors or qualities. We want to represent it as a series of patterns, with rich context to illustrate those patterns so that you don't get trapped into thinking about it in terms of causality and levers. Right? And that's what the landscape maps do, or technically they're topographies. So I've given you an example from one project, and this is we're trying to get permission to share with you. I've just written an article for the Oxford Book on Foresight, which puts all of this together. Sorry about the background noise. We live near one of the UK's military bases, and there are supply helicopters going overhead. I don't know what's going on, but something is, right? So basically, if you look at that landscape map on slide 2, what that shows is a series of patterns. Now, that actually came from presenting a set of cartoons to people, asking people to pick the cartoon which represented the culture of their organization, and then index it onto a series of triangles, all of which had positive qualities. So nobody can say anything negative, nobody knows what the right answer is. And then from that, we can produce a probability distribution, which in measurement terms, nobody can link input to output. So if you look at that in terms of culture, it shows effectively 3 dominant cultures within the organization.
Dave, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if there's, are we supposed to be seeing slides?
Yeah, you're meant to have had a copy to download.
Okay, yeah, we were going to, I just responded to you in the chat that we were planning to share the slides out a little later.
Okay. Okay, so leave that up for a second, but then could you take it down, because I really want to see people. So the idea was to put them in the chat now and people can have a look at them. So if we could do that, that would be good. Yeah. So if we could stop the screen share, please, Jocko. Yeah, sorry, I do need to see people, all right? So I compromised by making the slides available. So I think that's gone up now, all right?
Yeah, Jocko will share the link in a moment.
Okay. So basically, you can have a look at this in a minute, but what we got is a pattern which shows 3 dominant patterns within an organization. And you can click on that and you can read the stories which made it up. So we're not here, there's no factors in this which you can see. It's just a pattern with illustrative stories. right? And that's a way of representing an assembly, an assemblage, sorry, in terms of the way it works. And of course, because you really want to be pulsing that frequently, the assemblage structure is constantly changing, so you will see patterns over time, and some patterns will be more stable and other patterns will be less stable. Now, I've given that in the context of culture. We do the same thing in situational assessment. There's a whole variety of ways in which we use that representation. So the principle is to show a pattern or an assemblage. Now, the simplest explanation of assemblage is I tell a story, you tell a story, somebody else tells a story, we all like each other's stories, so we tell more of them. And on the internet, that gets amplified 100-fold. And there's a point where the story pattern, this is new materialism, if you want to look it up in philosophy, and Nick Fox is probably one of the best people on that. There's a point where the pattern gets enough solidity that it exists independently of the storytellers. And then it creates downwards causation in that people can't escape it. It's part of their life. And you can see this with Trump, you can see it with Brexit. There's a narrative pattern of people's day-to-day interchanges. And Trump was, by the way, was brilliant at triggering this with key phrases. He never told a story, he just uses phrases to keep the assembly structure going. These assemblages are a fundamental aspect of the way we make decisions. Andy Clark famously called about scaffolding, and he and I had a long discussion about this. Narrative is one of the ways that people scaffold consciousness, because it reduces the energy cost of making decisions, because we just fall within the narrative patterns of the tribe or the clan that we're a part of. And it's very difficult to escape from that. And one of the key phrases Deleuze talks about is he says, those assemblages, effectively, they territorialize the landscape. So you can't escape it. And there's this concept of lines of flight within Deleuze. But the key thing I want to talk about is deterritorialization. So if you want to break an assemblage, arguing with it rationally doesn't work. You've actually got to break it. And that is called deterritorialization. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways we do that. Because if you deterritorialize something, you open up the possibility of new patterns. If the situation is still territorialized, very few people will escape the pattern. So every time people mocked Trump in the States, they made the assembly structure worse. Because part of the assembly structure was the liberals don't understand us, they're intellectual, they're snotty. You can see all those sort of patterns in the way it works. So assume that assembly structures have a huge evolutionary capacity to adapt very quickly to threat. Once they're established. So they're very difficult to disturb. Right? So that's an assemblage, that's assemblage theory. You can see why we want to map it, because one of the other things we can do, and this is taking Stu Kaufman's idea of the adjacent possible, is we can map attractor wells close to the negative attractor. So if you've got a negative attractor, we can show where there's a pattern of stories, and that's where we get into the more stories like this, fewer stories like that concept. Because then, and this is deterritorialization, you're doing micro interventions. You're not saying, how do we make people non-Trump supporters and non-fascists? You're saying, how do we create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? And the stories you're asking for are close enough to where people are that that's a feasible shift. Again, that's the concept of adjacent possible. Now, you may occasionally need to make a stochastic leap, but that's maybe for the questions. That's something else I'm working on at the moment. So that's an assemblage. The second thing is Estuarine mapping, and that sort of fits into the slide on slide 3. This is a quote from Seneca, and I should say up front, I intensely dislike Seneca, and I've never liked the Stoics on broad principle, particularly Marcus Aurelius, who seems to me an excuse for imperial power and acceptance, but that's a personal prejudice. I'm open to be more reasonable in the question. But this is actually quite a good one, because it basically says we can know the present. Why do we keep talking about the future? So that was one input to this, and that was always a part of what we were doing. And then at the Hay Festival, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, I came across Constructor theory. And I'm not sure whether it was the Hay Festival or whether Alicia sent me an article. It was one or other, but they came at about the same time. This is Deutsch's work. And in Constructor theory, This is the first attempt in physics to look at a system as a whole, not to look at it in smallest possible parts. So, you know, the classic approach in physics is to break things down and break things down. I've always thought we went as far as we should do with quarks. I've always liked quarks because they come in threes, all right? Quarks are neat, right? After that, it all gets really difficult, right? What Deutsche was trying to do was to look at the whole, and basically his PhD student has written the book, The Science of Can and Can't, which is another way of talking about it. Basically says the first thing you need to do, and they call this a counterfactual, yeah, that has a double use in English, is you have to identify what can't change. Right? And then you have to identify constructors, and constructors they define as something which enables a transformation, but doesn't alter in the act of transformation. So you map the constructors, you map the counterfactuals, and then the fundamental principle is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. Yeah? One of their best papers is their account of evolution, because they describe evolution in terms of energy conservation, not in terms of survival of the fittest, and that gives you a very different take on the subject. Yeah, and I can come on to this and elsewhere, but you know, Clark's work as well is the same. So is free energy principle from Frisson. So is Seth's work. It's basically all of human cognition is seeking to reduce the energy costs of making decisions. Because if you have to scan everything and be totally rational, the energy cost is too high, you can't afford it. Which is why, if I come back to Clark, you're constantly doing micro hallucinations. Those hallucinations are interacting with reality, and you only think about it if you get an anomaly. If you don't get an anomaly, you just go with the flow. Yeah, we're not intelligent cameras, to use his phrase, which I think is rather a nice one there. Yeah. So that concept of the present and energy gradients was key, and that led into Estuarine mapping. And the basic Estuarine framework is a simple grid, which is energy cost of change against time to change. This is on slide 4 if you want to look at it. Yeah. Now, that was important, all right? And I started to sketch that, and I need to make a confession at this point. I originally sketched it as 2 lines with a 0 axis. And then one day I accidentally overreached on the iPad and drew the axis as going below the x-axis. The y-axis went down. I didn't dare admit I got it wrong given the audience, so I left it there, and it kind of like worked, yeah, which is a proof of serendipity. I just need to be honest about this, all right? It wasn't designed. It was an accident. So the basic concept is we want to create a grid, and we don't want to look at what we want to do in the future. We want to look at what we can actually change in the present. And this is, again, deterritorialization. The lower the granularity of the discussion, the less the politics and the less the bias. And granularity for me is becoming more important than I thought it was originally. Smaller things will combine and recombine in novel ways, bigger things won't. Right? So one of the ways you deterritorialize an assemblage is to reduce it down into much smaller components. Now, I'm giving you some of the theory behind on this. This works without the theory. If you go to sea level, I'm not doing the sea level presentation to you. I'm doing the theory-based presentation. And we want to decide what to map on that. And this has gone through various iterations, but we now have 3 things, yeah? Actors, constraints, and constructors. Yeah? Now that's come out of a mixture of practice and everything else. The collective name for all 3 is actants, and I'll come back to that later. So an actant is anything which has influence within the system. And I'm not drawing there on the tour, although there are some links with actor-nectar theory, but it's not quite the same use. Yeah? So what we said, and it's very easy to get to brainstorm this, what are the actors, what are the constraints, what are the constructors? And not get too fussed about which category it's in. This is a way of looking at it. And we had various typologies for constraints, and we've got 2 detailed ones, and one I'm working on with Alicia's book at the moment, because she did not publish a typology of constraints to help us all navigate it. So some of us are working on that in parallel. Yeah. But basically, we've now got a really simple one. Do they contain or do they connect? Yeah, everybody can get that. It avoids us having to talk about enabling and governing constraints, which was, you know, I got it, but it was very difficult to explain it to people. Whereas do they connect things or do they contain things is something any executive can understand, and they can start to come up with stuff. Yeah. In constructors, we looked at three things. So the essence of a constructor is it transforms things. Yeah. It is a type of constraint as well, by the way. You can put these either way, which way around. Yeah, and I've never disagreed with you on that, Alicia. I just think you have to explain it differently, right? So, sorry, I'm monitoring a few people like a hawk at this moment, right? So basically, constructors transform by one of three things: by passage, so that's like a ritual or a process; by presence. If you've ever been in a military meeting and you're having a good conversation with a bunch of colonels and majors, then a 3-star general walks in, everything changes. Yeah, so yeah, some constructors actually transform an event just by simple presence. And the third one is by contagion. Either by contagion, by wanting to avoid it, or wanting to actually be infected by it. And we're using contagion quite deliberately there. And actors are any, we try and focus people here on roles rather than individuals. Yeah, roles or groups rather than individuals, but sometimes individuals come up. So that's a brainstorm process. We can now do that with software. Those then get mapped onto the grid. And here we have an absolutely key rule in terms of the way we do this, is no compromises. If you disagree on something, break it down until you agree. Yeah? Because this is situational assessment. We know that people don't do accurate situational assessment if they're thinking about what they should do. So we're trying to get an objective situational assessment. So that means keep breaking it down until you agree. That gives rich discussions, as to what type it is or where it's placed on the grid. Once we got that, we draw 3 lines. So one is the counterfactual line. That's generally in the northeast area of the grid. Yeah, and that's the boundary between what can and can't be. So anything northeast of that, the energy cost of change or the time to change or some combination means that realistically it will not change. Now that of itself is hugely valuable. If you look at systems thinking over the last 30 years, it's always started with a group of executives getting together and agreeing some idealistic future state and trying to close the gap. And the trouble with that is you always end up being too idealistic and you don't take account of what you can actually change. So at this level alone, everything southwest of that line is what in biology is called an affordance. It's something you can actually change. It's an area you can actually play. So it affords you for change. That's why we sometimes call it an affordance landscape. Yeah. We then add 2 more lines. One is the liminal line. So that allows people to identify, well, theoretically this could change, but nobody would let us do it. Or in practice, we couldn't. Now that actually proves very useful, because if you present that to C-level executives and it's been produced by their managers, to date, my universal experience is said, well, they've never asked. People thought it was impossible to get agreement, but that sort of makes it visible. And you're not asking the executive to change things. You're saying, if we could make a case, could we? Yeah, and I'll come back to that on action types. Yeah. And then finally, bottom left is the vulnerable one, or the volatile one. We play around with both words here. And fundamentally what that does is it basically says anything here could, to use the American expression, turn on a dime. So if it has major impact, it's really significant because it could change without warning, without the need for anybody to do anything. Right? So that gives us our space. Yeah? So that's the total picture. Sorry, ignore that. Yeah. So coming back to this, right? So that grid, and I'll talk about the method of creation in a minute, then basically says, okay, so this is the total space. We then move people into actions on that. And the actions are to change where the actual constraints, constructors, or actors sit on the grid. So nobody at this point is saying, this is what we should do, or this is what I think will happen next. Your first task is to reduce the energy cost. So if you do want to do something, it will be easier to do. And one of the ways we're positioning this for executives at the moment is a pre-process. Don't start a project without doing an Estuarine map. Don't start a change program without doing an Estuarine map. And don't jump into big changes until you've done small changes so you know what big changes are sustainable. Yeah, and that is actually a key principle that people are buying into. Yeah. And so if you look at the action types, which we sort of listed, yeah, they're in three basic groups: vectors, signals, and communication. And the most common type on this is what's called a compass rose. And by the way, we're just finishing off the Hexi facilitation kits on this. So each of these action types will be a transparent overlay you can drop onto something which you brainstormed, and people can move it around. So we're making that really easy to manage for facilitators. Yeah. So compass rose means what it says is which direction do we want to move this in. We might want to move it north, or we want to increase the energy cost so it can't happen accidentally. We might want to move it southwest. It's so critical we need to reduce the energy cost of change and the time to change. Yeah, or we might want to move stuff around. So compass rose is key. And interestingly, I was talking with the NHS about this earlier on today. Instead of looking at the massive problem and no, it's just too big, it's just energy draining to look at the problem of reform, start off with an Estuarine map and find small things you can change, and then do lots of small things, see what happens. Yeah, so that in many ways is a better way of tackling intractable problems anyway. Destroy something. Sometimes things just have to be got rid of. Stabilize, you're happy with where it is. Monitoring, obviously boundary conditions get monitored because if those change, you want to know quickly. Trigger, which isn't recommended, but sometimes it may be so critical you have to make a change. We found one of the things which fell below the x-axis is things which had huge momentum, which people couldn't stop. And that's what they use the area below the x-axis for, which is quite interesting when you looked at that. Conditional, that's, that would, for example, link to market life cycle. Like when the market gets commoditized, the energy cost of doing this will be very low, but the market is in growth phase dominated by an apex predator. So the energy cost of disrupting that is almost impossible. So those are, when we do this, we can do something, but not otherwise. And that's obviously linked with monitors. And then research, we need to look into this. Requests, we need to ask permission for change. And then the most recently added to this, which is changing the visibility. So if you make, and that will come into what I'm going to talk about in a moment or two on distributed decision support. If you make what people are doing visible, then they will innovate less and they will take fewer risks. If you reduce visibility, they're more likely to take risks. So this isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It's a mixture of both. Yeah? So, for example, the work we're doing on distributed decision support and distributed resource allocation means that within a group of decision makers, there is one completely anonymous role and nobody knows who it is. If you have a completely anonymous role, people are more honest than if you just delegate authority. Yeah, and you don't know who the person is, it could be whatever. So that's an example of transparency. So once we've done that, those actions then get mapped onto Cynefin or any decision form framework. We've also got the assemblage patterns, which we've done in parallel. Some aspects of that will generate constraints and constructors, but some will be the more like this, fewer like that changes, and we can consolidate changes from both groups. And that's where Cynefin comes in, but you don't have to use Cynefin at that point. So the basic principle of Estuarine mapping is what can we actually change and how can we make the process of change lower energy, lower time before we commit to change. Or the way I've been summarizing it of late is how do you make the energy cost of sin higher than the energy cost of virtue? So that's a board principle. So that leads me on to what is the risky slide, but I'm quite pleased with this. It's sort of coming together at the moment, so I will probably publish it shortly. And we've been playing around with various ways to have conversations, as I said, and the easiest thing to explain to executives, you can actually explain emergence. It's not too difficult. And you can use the, complex systems are entangled. Again, I use Alicia's like bramble bushes in a thicket a lot, but then I have to explain bramble bushes and I have to explain a thicket, which takes a long time sometimes. So you can also use mangrove roots. But you remember the Greek origin of complex is entangled. The Latin origin of complicated is folded. And that's another good way of getting the point across. So a highly entangled system has high levels of path dependency. You never get a greenfield site if you're changing human systems. Humans have memories. Those memories form part of what you're trying to do. All that sort of language, which you all probably are familiar with. But if you read the literature, and this is me summarizing it, there are 3 necessary but not sufficient conditions for emergence. One is you have to have a lot of actants. Yeah, now I'm using actant to mean physical things as well as people things. Yeah, so anything which has some sort of influence on the system. You have to have a lot of actants, and you have to have highly rich, highly local interactions. If you look at a termite's nest, for example, all of the complication of their behavior in the nest building comes from genetically coded rules responding to 64 distinct pheromone traces. Yeah, I talk about the waggle dance a bit in a minute or two if people want, because we're starting to work on that in bees. Yeah. And by the way, just as a side note, nature has evolved hundreds and hundreds of ways of optimizing search without knowledge of where things are. Yeah, and we're now starting to build some of that stuff into software. Yeah. So either way, so I've got actants, I've got interactions, and none of the actors must have knowledge of the whole. So in a slightly mischievous mode, that's where you say, if you talk about seeing things holistically, you probably haven't understood complexity. Partly because you can't. There's just too many things going on. Yeah, doesn't mean you can't treat the system as a system, but you can't know it in the sense that, for example, systems dynamics tries to map it. Yeah, that's not possible. And also, if you start to deal with the system as a whole, then the political actors will dominate the discussion about what should happen, and we're trying to avoid that. Yeah, so that's where we bring in 2 things, monitoring and scaffolding. So the way you spot emergence is you need to monitor. The EU field guide basically says you need to use your own employees as a sensor network. Some, 17% of radiologists see a gorilla, whereas 83% don't. Yeah, you need to find those people before they talk to anybody else. So the use of SenseMaker there as a distributed decision support tool is key. And we're about to start to use that in AI, by the way, to monitor attitudes to AI and the ability to discriminate between AI output and human input. But we want to do that at scale across the whole workforce in real time. Right? So that sort of real-time feedback loop, mass monitoring is absolutely key. And again, we're trying to shift away from patterns and text into voice and pictures and effectively semiotics, not just language. Right? Language is useful, but it's not enough. Yeah? And scaffolding, this is where Anne Pendleton, Julian and I did a lot of work. Scaffolding is actually a level of structure in the system that you can rely on. Now, this will come back to something I'll say in a minute. Effectively, it's a counterfactual. It's not going to change. Right? And there are various types of scaffolding. So I can have the sort of bamboo or steel that people put up and take away once the building is safe. I can have an endoskeleton and exoskeleton. They have different qualities. I can have the healing lattices people put over burns to create a structure around which the skin regrows and it leaves nutrients in the system. And there are various other forms of scaffolding. Right? So the AIMS framework basically says, and this is to make it really simple for executives, you can manage the actants, you can manage the interactions, you can create the scaffolding, you need to monitor the system, and you need to respond very quickly to amplify good things and dampen bad things. So that's the fundamental principle of getting that across. And trying to break, I'm using actants deliberately to avoid the way that, for example, Santa Fe use agents, yeah, or to try and avoid people thinking, oh, is it all as people? Yeah, so you're trying to use language there to differentiate it a bit. Yeah. Then the second element on this was we've been attacking the concept of mental models and mindset now for several years and become more significant in it. Human beings don't have mental models. That was a sort of rather quaint concept in the 1980s, rather like double loop learning, but we know a lot more about it now. Yeah, there aren't models on the brain through which we process data. There are in computers. But most human decision-making is distributed. This is the 4 E's if you want to look it up, which Clark was the first, which Chambers was one of the first to produce. Yeah, knowledge is deeply embodied. There are whole aspects of human decision-making which require physical evolution of the biology of the body before we can do it. When your hand pulls away from a hot plate, The brain fires after the event, not because you don't have free will. That's a Dawkins and Barbara nonsense. But the brain is double checking if the automatic response was correct or not. And if there was an anomaly, it may need to change the process. All right. So your body, and coming back to assemblages, the narrative structures of the communities in which you live, those actually have a far more significant part in decision making than conscious thought. That only clicks in when you actually sense anomalies. I'm walking down the street, I don't think about walking until I stumble, then I think about it. Which means dissent is critical for sense making because it creates anomalies within the system. You can't have conformance. So that was assemblage, affordance, and agency is our alternative. So instead of saying what's the right mindset or what are the right mental models, you say what are the assemblages, what are the narrative patterns which are influencing how people make decisions that they will find difficult to escape from, what are the affordances available to them in their environment, and what degree of agency do they actually have. And of course, agency isn't quite the same thing as actors, but it comes close to that. So then we've got actants divided into actors, constraints, and constructors. Constraints and constructors can become scaffolding if you move them into the counterfactual space of your Estuarine map. So you make the energy cost of the time to change so hard that nobody will attempt to change them because you need that as stability within the system. So that hangs that bit together. And basically then I've got narrative topographies, I've got Estuarine mapping, I'm moving into Cynefin. So that was when we started to get excited because that's putting everything onto one fairly simple diagram with a limited amount of things to learn. Yes, there's a lot more to learn on that, but that actually is quite a good starting point. And then kind of like a few summary things, complex systems scale by decomposition and recombination. And one of the insights I had after the retreat in Washington is Alicia, we can come on to this later. We said when we decompose by consensus, by agreement, there's a danger we lose friction in the system. And because I wasn't allowed to rebut her straight away, which was really frustrating, I was sitting there getting in a state. I had to think about it. And I said, well, actually, what we do when we reassemble, that's when we introduce the anomalies. So we deterritorialize to avoid politics, but then we recombine, and then we actually create different frictions, which will mean the system is capable of different types of evolution. And again, that's a different way of preventing equiprobability within the system. So that decompose by decomposition and recombination is a key principle. It's what DNA is based on. Three basic principles of how to manage anthro-complexity, which haven't changed in years: optimize the granularity, which generally means making it smaller; distribute sense making, because you have to have multiple input to understand what's going on; and then disintermediate decision makers. Decision makers must have direct access to the raw data without interpretive layers. And that was the other thing we designed SenseMaker for. And then three things to avoid, and this has changed recently. One is premature convergence, converging too quickly onto a solution. And generally now, I'm not sure about this one, but I've now put the second one in as working directly on a problem. In complexity, you're better working indirectly, not directly. And there's some actually good books on that as well, which indicate that, which you can reference on that. And finally, avoid retrospective coherence. That's the famous, if there are 4 dots, there are 64 possible patterns. If there are 10 dots, there are over 3.5 trillion. So the idea you can join up the dots. Well, yes, you can do it with the benefit of hindsight, but hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. So that's a rough simplification. Final point is we're now sort of, I called this anthro-complexity years ago because I want to distinguish complexity in human systems from basically complexity in bird flocking behavior and termite nests. All right. And we identified that as linked to intelligence, to identity, and to intention. So there is an ethical aspect, an axiological aspect to that. I see a huge overlap between what we do and what I've termed computational complexity, which is Santa Fe. There's just that difference. I don't think Santa Fe see an overlap with us because I think they can do everything with models, with some exceptions. The other two schools, one is The other one is systems thinking. Now, what's interesting is you can look at systems thinking from three perspectives. One is systems dynamics, which, to be quite honest, even the main systems thinkers are trying to pretend they weren't associated with now, which is the sort of Senge causal loop diagrams. They all get really upset if you associate them with Peter Senge and get all upset about it, right? Cybernetics, pattern languages are quite useful if we change the granularity. Yeah, and soft systems is fine, but it doesn't scale. So I'm getting a bit more reasonable about this. But the main point I'm trying to make is that systems thinking has historically attempted to handle complexity and done a reasonable job, but now we have the science. Yeah, so fundamentally, we lose gravity before Newton, but after Newton, everything changes. And we now know much more about the science of complex adaptive systems. And I've argued for years that Stafford Beer would never have created the VSM model if he'd known about complexity science, because it would have given him a simpler way of dealing with it. But that is quite controversial. And the final group, I think we have no overlap with at all, is the kind of like psychodynamic school, the psychotherapy school, which sees complexity all about individual change, individuals surviving complexity. That's associated with Tavistock and, to be honest, with Ralph Stacey, the second Ralph Stacey, not the first Ralph Stacey. The first one's easier to deal with. So sorry, I've rambled about on that for the best part of an hour, so apologies for that. I wanted to make it shorter. But the fundamental thing we're trying to get to is this really simple way of explaining complexity in human systems to executives and to government in such a way that they feel they can do something about it, rather than see it as something abstract. Now, we're probably not all the way yet, but this is the attempt. At that point, I'll stop. There's more stuff I can dive into, but I thought I'd now open up for conversations.
Okay, yes, have a drink. And I am going to suggest that as many of you as possible raise your Zoom hand if you have a question, because the chat is pretty full. So anybody want to kick us off? Alicia, he mentioned you several times, but we'll ask Mark to unmute himself and ask his question first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dave. Fascinating talk, as always. I do have a question. When you're talking about changing, the energy of virtue versus the energy of sin on your Estuarine map, when you plot it initially, you are plotting the energy and time to change something, not the energy and time to follow the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're changing the energy on it, it's shifting it so that it's easier to change, but it's not necessarily showing the path that somebody would follow operationally, as it were.
And it's deliberately doing that. It says you first of all need to make the thing as flexible as possible, so if you decide to do things will be easier, not more difficult. Yeah, and it's much easier to get consensus on that. We've already shown that with a couple of companies. We can get 40 or 50 micro actions from people who've been in major political dispute, and they all agree they need to do that before they come back to the dispute. But I mean, and thanks for that, Mark, because a lot of people think it's about change. It isn't. It's about changing things so you could change them, which is a bit paradoxical. But you get my.
Sorry to bounce on that. So your example that you've given in other talks about the London taxi drivers, effectively, it's a counterfactual that you could change how quickly they absorb the information. Yeah. All you could change is your approach. Say, I want GPS rather than a human.
Yeah. So what that basically, and that's why I've used that as an illustration, because it says actually it's not a counterfactual because you can change it, but it takes 2.5 years. That's the minimum period. If you want to develop more taxi drivers, it's 2.5 years. Energy cost is quite low because they do it in their own time. Sat nav's much faster, but a huge energy cost. Yeah. And by the way, the other consequence on London taxi drivers, which I'm emphasizing a lot, is when I was an expert witness on this, I was having difficulty persuading people to keep taxi drivers until I put up the rape statistics of black cabs against other cabs. And there's virtually zero sexual assaults in black cabs, but there are significant numbers in all other cabs. And the reason is that 2.5 years, that process of professionalization is also key to the development of ethics. And we keep forgetting this. Ethics evolves over time. Ethics in behavior evolve over time. They're not something you just decide on a rule base, which, by the way, is another problem with AI. Alexandra?
Yes, I have two questions. One is on the energy to change. Sometimes some constraints need to stay there, and so it may require energy just to stay there. And so, does that make sense? Or is that ever happened?
That's a stabilize action. How do we keep it there?
Okay. And then on the actions is why do you have somehow these sets of threes and not more? I mean,
because I like quarks. Sorry, I like things in threes. All right. If you look at my blog, I can't ever have a list of something which isn't 3, 5, or 7. I just can't cope with 4s and 6s. All right. But to be fair, that's Anna. Anna structured it into 3 groups of 3 because it makes it easier for people to remember. Yeah? And you know how 3 works. I mean, if 3 princes goes on a quest, you know that the 3rd one will succeed, right?
Okay, Lexim Monser, am I reading that correctly?
Wendy
hiding behind a brown.
Wendy, I thought it was Wendy. I was like, is that Wendy? What?
It was.
Don't try to confuse me.
It's when she says neuromancy, you really want to worry about it.
I'm like trying to read this and I'm like, what's happening here? Okay.
Wendy Alford. Simple question. And Indigenous cultures easily see what we would see as objects in the world as being actors, actually having agency in the world. And I'm referring a little bit to the Sydney work where we had we were exposed to the idea of a chair having agency in our lives, but a tree has agency in an Indigenous life, and a river is alive. So it's easy to make that statement of objects acting on us, but the resistance that you see in Western cultures about nature being animated and actually having acting on us is a little bit harder for.
I would use different examples, Wendy.
But it's really important.
And the example I use is an appalling production of Shakespeare's Macbeth I went to a few months ago, which was truly terrible. And I get really upset when people badly perform Macbeth because it was the first role I ever played at school. All right, so I'm precious about Macbeth. Yeah, but basically the stage took over from the actors. All right, and you can talk in organizations about processes. I mean, yeah, when I was working with Tyson and JD, they got this instantly, and they would do. But in Western environments, you just have to talk about processes and building design, yeah, and staging, because everybody understands that physical things have agency in humans. That's what we design for. Yeah, a traffic light, if you think about it, is a constructor.
So you use some tangible things that people would recognize in their own lives, and then you're not relying on. I mean, nature, you could say a flood acts on you. It's pretty easy, but when something looks passive, it's harder to say.
Yeah, and you don't want to get the new age label with the average executive. You want to give them examples they understand, all right? But I'm also doing a lot these days talking about waggle dancer bees and the way that fungal networks will redistribute resourced saplings from older trees in forests. And exactly as a get in that, because it says you've got network ability to distribute resources. It doesn't require conscious effort, and that's where we're working with distributed decision support. So I think you can give natural examples which people can resonate with, but you don't want to go in anything which makes you feel that you're talking to trees or moving into panpsychism or anything like that. That gets you into a bad place pretty fast.
My point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Jocko, do you have your hand up, or is that your background? Sorry, okay. Alton?
You're muted, Alton.
Fascinating talk as always. I am one of those regulators that you are talking to, and I think you are very, very enlightening, but you may be over the head of most regulators. And I think your conversation with Wendy about bringing it down with some kind of stories or things that regulators can relate to is really, really important, because they even have a problem grasping, because I'm advocating a lot of what you're talking about in my agency, and they have a difficult time grasping even the basic concepts. I hate to say that, but it is the truth.
I'm talking less about the theory now.
Yeah.
First of all, I think there's a whole group of people who will not buy this stuff until the market is taking it over. So you just have to realize that and qualify them out. But regulators have got a really significant problem at the moment on distribution of resources. So I'll just take a sidebar on this briefly. If you're one of the big banks, you know that if you could allocate 50 amounts of $1,000, it would have bigger impact than if you allocated 50 million. But you can't audit the allocation of 50 $1,000 amounts. It's just too hard. Yeah. And the other basic rule, by the way, which is in all development banks, is that the people who are best at getting the grants are probably the people who shouldn't be given the money. It's kind of like a good heuristic or rule of thumb. This is the same, I think, on EU grants, Alessandro, but that's another matter, right? So what we're now looking at, and this is working with Asia Development Bank, with UNDP and others, is if a village, we can define 5 roles in a village. So head person, oldest girl in the school, priest. You can define a set of roles, and one of the roles, and the roles mustn't go above 5. And there's all sorts of reasons for that in human evolution. We evolved to compromise in groups of 5 or less, but we don't. We go back into tribes if we go bigger. Yeah. And one of the roles is completely anonymous, so nobody knows who it is. If you can assemble that group of roles, you can spend $1,000, provided you record why you did it and what happened. And then the rest of the 50 million can follow the projects which work rather than the projects which don't. Now, we're now actually about to move, and if anybody's interested, we're going to make this more public. We're going to run into 6 months of simulation within 3 health services, in which we'll experiment with using that method to make clinical decisions and to allocate resources so that we can take out 60% of the bureaucracy, but actually increase the auditability and accountability. Now, I've got regulators really, really interested in that, because I've talked about a practical approach to a problem they face, and I haven't explained the theory behind it at much level. I think that's where we're starting to go now.
That's an excellent approach. An excellent approach. I applaud that.
That's also market life cycle. When you sell to early adopters, you explain the theory. When you sell to early majority, you explain what they can get.
Right.
Yeah, it's a basic principle. Anybody who's been in strategy knows that. And lots of companies go under because they don't make that switch fast enough.
Right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Shasta?
Hi. This is kind of to go back to that discussion with Wendy, and I might be just like sidetracked here, but and I understand what you were saying about bringing the example of an object acting on somebody down to a level that's more palatable, I guess, to the C-suite. But I'm wondering if there is a real differentiation between, and if it's important to somehow bring into the conversation about how the environment is something where it is happening to us, and it's something we kind of have affected, and how that's different than the stoplight example, which is obviously very man-made.
And it's quite likely to come in if you properly get the constraints and constructors out, but it will come in at a micro level. So human change doesn't happen at a macro level. It happens at a micro level, unless something suffers trauma. And that's the problem. We're asking people to solve the problem of global warming, and it contrasts with their day-to-day concerns or problems. And I wrote a big blog post on this, and we've got work on it, yeah, which basically says until people make small sacrifices in their day-to-day life related to the environment, the dispositional state of the system will not permit politicians to make the big sacrifices. And that may be quite depressing, but that's fact, yeah. So focusing people on small changes and waiting for critical mass is about the only way forward, you know, at that level. So what you've got to do, and I think, you remember when we did our original work on this, we facilitated in Denmark, so we could facilitate in English, but not actually know what people were talking about. And the essence of any of these approaches is that you can't come in to a process with a value system of your own. You have to find out what's sustainable for the organization you're working with. Yeah. So I don't disagree with you. It's just how you do it at what level of granularity.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for, I'll read the article.
Hey, Stefan?
Hi there. Thanks for the talk, Dave. What's your thoughts on energy kind of levels moving between big organizations merging? Say, IBM taking over Red Hat, or big Swiss bank taking another one. How that impacts, all the small changes you were working on, and then something massive.
So one day I was sat in the New Zealand IBM office with a country general manager, and he just had a delivery of a new crate of Pinot. So we decided we'd taste one of the bottles, and that was too good. So we went on to another bottle. And then we got into it because both of us had accountancy financial backgrounds. And we actually went through every single IBM acquisition over the past 20 years and worked out how big IBM should be if they just maintained organic growth in all of the acquisitions. And it was a really scary figure, because the reality is they just kept themselves going by cannibalizing other companies and losing value on every acquisition. So I think there is a piece of work to be done on the maximum size an organization can get to. And the work I was doing for Lou Gerstner before Ginny Rometty killed it was to see, could we make IBM the equivalent of a Portuguese man of war? Because a Portuguese man of war is a collection of symbiotes, defined by their interactions, which provides coherence. And I'd worked that out in South Africa and New Zealand, but Ginny killed it because she wanted a manufacturing organization. And I say that's the work we're now doing on feeding observation, waggle dance. Waggle dance of bees is fascinating, right? So we're now looking to build the waggle dance into SenseMaker as part of Estuarine Mapping, as an alternative to Delphi technique. Because bees don't make decisions by reductionist processes. They make decisions by multiple minor interactions, and the temperature of the bees then determines where they go. You don't need consciousness to actually find the best haunt. And that stuff is really big. Yeah. Alicia, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Yes, she has. Well, she's come in and gone. She's, she puts it up, she takes it down.
I just want other people to get a chance to talk. No, I tend to hog the conversation. I don't want to do that. But following up on this biological metaphor with the bees.
Oh, yeah.
Can you find any example of deterritorialization in nature? Because it doesn't seem, I can understand what Deleuze meant with territorializing the landscape. To me, it's like turning the landscape rugged to create more local attractors and topologies and characteristics and assemblages within it. But I don't seem to like the idea of deterritorialization in the way that you seem to use it to mean breakage. I took notes, and you always say break. You have to break an assemblage, otherwise, so that a new pattern can emerge. Otherwise, it will reassemble itself. But then you followed up talking about the adjacent possible. And it would seem to me that's a much better, he's drinking. a much better use of the idea that I think you want to promote than breakage. I don't know. I'm not crazy about this idea of deterritorialization.
A couple of things. First of all, no, I can't see any example in nature, and I wouldn't expect to. Yeah, because assemblages go with narrative, and narrative is uniquely human. So it's a phenomenon of human systems. Yeah, and that's
what is breakage?
No, assemblages.
Language.
Assemblages are a human phenomenon in Deleuze. They're not a natural phenomenon.
In Deleuze, sure, but we're expanding that, right?
Yeah, so no, but nature is naturally deterritorialized. Human beings have found ways to territorialize space through narrative, whereas nature does it in slightly different ways, all right? But so we're using assemblage purely in the sense of narrative assemblages per Deleuze, all right, which is human. So that's one thing. All right? Secondly, I've never talked about breaking them. I've talked about deconstruction, which is different from breaking.
Oh, you used the word breaking and breakage several times.
I don't think I have. All right. I mean, I'm prepared. If you can find that, I will find a way to try and delete it and remove it from the record.
All right.
I'm pretty sure I haven't done that recently. I've actually talked about deconstruction and reducing decontextualization. All right. And so that to me is an important concept. All right. So that's the reduction to the lowest level of granularity to allow recombination.
But why do you want decontextualization? I mean, you started out your talk by saying that the advantage of ethnography, in my terminology, is that you're embedded in the organization. You're not just doing interviews as an external person who gets plopped into the thing. So it would seem to me that what you're looking for is that interface between an assemblage and the context within which it assembled. And one of the things this new book is talking about that I really like, because I mention it only in passing in the book, and that is everybody's always concerned about boundaries. And so therefore the boundary of what's inside, what's outside, what exactly does the interface work? The best people tend to have used is the notion of membranes and the fact that, but what this book is starting to emphasize is phase separation as a boundary. So if you want to understand the way the context influences the assemblage that coalesces within it, how about looking at the relationships among the phases and the densities and so on, and sort of tweaking that as an attempt to get change?
Okay, so two things. One is the essence of an assemblage is that it doesn't have boundaries.
There is no essence to an assemblage. It's context dependent. There is no internal essence.
I'm not using essence in a platonic sense of the list.
No, not in a platonic sense. Right. In the sense that people talk about, oh, it's their nature to be this way. That's the essence.
No, okay. And an assemblage is a phenomena which you can describe and you can explain the reason, right? If you don't want to use essence, I use something else, right? So an assemblage doesn't necessarily have boundaries. It acts like an attractor well, right? And it's almost so there may be a phase shift boundary, right? Secondly, Cynefin is defined by phase shifts. So phase shifts are actually a way of deterritorialization. Yeah, and that's one of the ways that you can actually do it, right? Because if you can trigger a phase shift, you get a dramatic change. Now, if you remember the work you and I did in Singapore, we were looking at fitness landscapes and saying, can we actually predict when these are ready to destabilize through a phase shift? Because that can be positive or negative, and that's still part of that particular body of work. Yeah. So one of the reasons to map the assemblage is to actually map when it's ready to destabilize. Yeah. Because if it destabilizes, you need to identify that, because then you can actually guide the recombinations. I'm using recombinations as plural there. Okay? So I'm not disagreeing on phase shift as a change, but I'm saying this very simple structure. There are narrative patterns which act like strange attractors. People can't escape them. And the reason I'm passionate about that is that's what I see with Trump and with Brexit and with populism. Their basic form of influence is to stimulate and maintain an assemblage structure that people can't escape. Yeah, and you will not overcome that by rational argument. You have to overcome it by creating lines of flight, that's adjacent possible, or by decontextualizing the thing so that a phase shift is possible in the process.
That's better than breakage.
Hmm?
That's way better than the word breakage.
Yeah, and that's why if you can find out where I've used that, I will apologize humbly in whichever the source is, because you can't break an assemblage. You can't, right? It's not possible.
Okay,
I
well,
think you can, but you end up with nothing. You end up with a vacuum and chaos, and that's Worcester, as one of my grandkids says.
well, we've recorded this, so we'll post it in a week or so, and then whoever's interested can do a deep dive and find out if Dave said anything about breaking things.
Craig.
Doesn't sound like me. I believe in breaking metamodernists, but that's entirely different. All right, that's just a hygiene condition.
I was just going to say sport. Okay, Alicia.
That's it. Ask
okay.
Craig.
Okay, Greg.
It was when you started with that, Alicia, I was thinking about shallow dive into chaos. It came to mind. Because I think you can basically change the assemblage. I was thinking of Delander's story about basically the archer, the horseman, the horse and the bow. Because each of those actually do have coherence. But the thing that it just touched on before, Dave, I thought you might have touched on wisdom of crowd, because I saw that as it's somewhat a play against basically knowing the whole, or that delusion of knowing the whole.
What, wisdom of crowds?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think, we actually see wisdom. The one of those we use SenseMaker is to present a situation, everybody interprets it. And the key thing is nobody must be connected with anything else, because if nobody is connected, you get a Gaussian distribution, so you've got predictability. The minute people connect and have conversations, you've got a Pareto distribution, so you haven't got predictability anymore. So one thing SenseMaker does is basically to punch something out to the whole workforce, get them to index it without talking with each other, and shows the patterns of that interpretation, so you can see dominant views, minority views, and outliers. Yeah, that's wisdom of crowds. Remember, there are three preconditions for wisdom of crowds, and Saranaki gets this wrong as well in the book. He lists the conditions, and he gets one example wrong. One is the people making the decision must have tacit knowledge of the situation. Yeah, so if you want to get farmers to guess the weight of a cow, that works, but employing McKinsey's to guess the weight of a cow is probably a bad idea, right? You won't get fired for doing it, but it's a bad idea, right? Secondly, none of the farmers must know what the other farmers have guessed, and that's the Gaussian, not Pareto focus, yeah? The third one, which everybody forgets, is it must be a game. Yeah, there must be no personal consequences for getting it wrong. And that's really important for the thing to work, right? And again, there's lots of things which go behind that in terms of the way we construct it.
Yeah, there was a thing that came off the back of that, which is thinking about, well, actually, can you then do that in SenseMaker and the topology to effectively put that in as a guard condition? But that's, something to talk about another day.
That's where I'm going with, and we're currently looking for investment in this one because it's a much bigger thing that we can do on the back of revenue, right? So what we're looking at is in the waggle dance, when bees swarm, it's temperature induced when a new swarm is created. And there's something for that, by the way, about merger and demerger of companies. There's an energy gradient within the hive which triggers the drones to create a new queen. Right? And then a group of the drones go with the new queen and hang off a tree. And the drones go out and try and find a new base. And then they come back to the swarm and they do the figure of eight dance on the swarm. And the orientation of the figure of eight to the sun and the swarm tells the other bees where to go. And where you get an accumulation, I think it's 40 bees in a new site. One of those bees goes to the swarm, goes into the center of the swarm and agitates the swarm. And when the temperature hits 95, the whole swarm goes to the new location. But interestingly, there are bees in the swarm which only disrupt the dances. And that's really important if you think about complexity theory. You've got that disruptive element. So we're now looking to build software to do that, to replicate that in a human system as an alternative to Delphi. Yeah, with both those factors on it. Yeah, so that you can actually allow a solution to emerge through multiple human interactions over time.
I'll hand it back to Alicia.
Does anybody else want to ask a question?
And Dave, I'd like to point out that Alicia will be coming on soon, and you can join us and ask her a bunch of questions as well.
I asked her about Deleuze last time, and I didn't get the answer I expected. So.
Now, my question now is that you just mentioned the terms energy gradient, which you had not used before, and that does not fall under the category of either contain or connect, which is why I'm perfectly happy with the connect, but I'm not too crazy about only the contain. It seems to be only a restrictive understanding of constraints, and certainly constructors don't only fall under the category of connecting, but they also seem to be, I mean, if they only do connections, then they're only constructors. But insofar as they are actants, it seems to me that you need notions like gradients, polarities, charge, all sorts of other generally inhomogeneities. So among the actants, I would say inhomogeneities and connections rather than containments.
I'll have a think about that. I'm not sure. I need to have a think about the language on that.
Okay.
Because the principle we're trying to get to is, I know there's more accurate language for everything I've talked about, but we got to the point where we can get people without the theoretical background to have a meaningful discussion using those terms. Right? So one of the things we want to build is more typologies. So that's why I've been going through your book to create a new typology based on the various types of constraint you've got into that. All right. We've already got the resilient robust constraint we've used for some time, which is in the field guide. So we want to create more typologies, yeah, and levels of sophistication as people start to accumulate things. Yeah. But at the moment, we're trying to make the entry point really simple for people. Yeah. So, and sometimes we don't even introduce contain or connect. We just talk about constraints, constructors, yeah, and actors and see what people come up with. Yeah. There is this deep, I mean, you and I had this discussion once, and I said, look, I can't use constraints there because everybody associates it with theory of constraints and Goldratt. And you said, well, it's not a problem for me in academic life. And I said, well, it's a real bloody problem for me in industry. All right. And I think there's that, yeah, that's that element of what we're trying to do here. Yeah. Eva?
Okay, Eva, yeah.
Hello, my name is Roman. This is my daughter's account.
I was going to ask.
Okay. I was confused, but
Talk about problems with identity.
I'm from Romania. English is my third language, so for me it was quite a challenge to understand some concepts. I think I was very lucky to stumble on a basic course about complexity like 4 years ago at Santa Fe of Melanie Mitchell. I'm very honored to be in a live event with Dave Snowden. I was listening again. It was an accident, an anomaly that I found his videos on YouTube. So thank you, Barbara and Joko, for organizing and giving me this opportunity. So there are a couple of challenges in Romania. First of all, there are only bad and destructive narratives at the macro and micro levels. So I think that's a big barrage in front of Romania's development. Second, I didn't find any persons that I could interact about complexity. Everybody's linear thinking here. So for me, it's a new field and I find a lot of sense in it. So having this context, could you please elaborate or give example about how scaffolding works? This is the point I'm still trying to understand. What's scaffolding? How does it work?
So one thing before we do that, we're actually running an event in Transylvania next year.
Oh,
right?
do
And
you
there
have
is a
any?
community in Romania who understand Cynefin and complexity. And I'm
Uh,
working with your former national bank on complexity-based interventions to re-energize Romanian society.
yes, we really need that. So
So
you're very
there are
welcome.
things going on in Romania, and I love Transylvania anyway, right?
Yeah, it's a bit different region from the Bucharest or the East, so
if
they're
you could
free.
you could just throw our king out from it, so I don't have to risk meeting him if I go there. It would be good, right? So there's actually some quite interesting stuff going on in Romania and elsewhere. I can make some links for you on that, all right?
Yes, I would be
Scaffolding.
thankful.
This is a design concept. It came out of the work we did on design. If you read Anne Pendleton Julian's book with John Seeley Brown, Design Unbound, yeah, you'll find quite a lot in that which covers that. So what we were looking at is, and I'll go through the typology, but to explain it quickly. Scaffolding provides a degree of certainty in human systems. So, for example, we all agree in the UK we'll drive on the left-hand side of the road. That radically reduces the energy cost of decision-making when you're driving. Yeah, if you drive south of Naples, well, the way to drive south of Naples, just to help you out on this, is follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision, because it's a flocking behavior and nobody follows the rules.
Same in Bucharest.
Yeah, no, I've tried to drive in Bucharest once, all right? I'm not doing it again, right? And Rome is easy in comparison, right? But the point is, both of those provide scaffolding. So heuristics provide scaffolding, rules provide scaffolding, because you've got predictability. So the famous case on this is Napoleon's March to the Sound of the Guns. And that actually was probably the major factor in him winning wars across Europe, because it gave a distributed coordination capability into his armies. Because people had a rule to follow, yeah, if they didn't know what to do, and they also knew that other people would be following those rules. So you've got a distributed cognitive capability within the system. So to be quite honest, the Italian driving habit south of Naples is probably better in complexity, where the system breaks down, right? So that's one type of scaffolding. We have endoskeletons, right? That isn't going to change, right? And endoskeletons allow things to grow to huge size. Whereas exoskeletons, the maximum size an insect can be is about this size before gravity kills it. So all those giant ant movies, sorry, it can't happen, right? It's just not possible. Sorry to disappoint you, but it's not physically possible. Yeah, unless you're on Mars or somewhere like that. Yeah. And there's other reasons why they wouldn't succeed there. So those are two types of scaffolding, right? One of the things which Anne and I came up with is dark scaffolding. So that's extreme sports. So this is rather like London Taxi Driver. So one day, some idiot decided to jump off a cliff in Norway, yeah, with a wingsuit. Now, why somebody decided to do that, nobody will ever understand. I mean, the guy has to be insane. I attribute it to the fact we don't allow people to risk their lives exploring anymore, so people are finding other routes. But then it takes about 20, 25 years for the scaffolding to emerge around that sport. Because it can't be designed up front, it has to evolve. The technology has to evolve, the practices have to evolve. So dark scaffolding is really important. So things like matrons in the British Health Service were a form of dark scaffolding. They were removed and we had mass disintegration of health service as a result. So the problem with dark scaffolding is it's there, it's giving structure, but you may not be aware of it. And there's techniques to discover that. So the concept of scaffolding, and when the final bit on the diagram is you say, well, actually constraints and constructors shifted into the counterfactual create scaffolding.
Okay.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that because it gives a degree of stability, and that's actually part of what human beings do. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Much better. Thank you so much.
Richard?
Hey, Rich. Yeah, Rich, thanks for raising your hand because I didn't want to have to read your question in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Barbara and Jocko, for hosting. And Dave, it's good to see you again after a couple of weeks. It's given me a chance to sort of digest what we went through over several days in DC. So looking at figure 2 in the slide deck and the topographical map, we the adjacent possible is identified, and it seems to assume a certain amount of directionality. And I wonder if that adjacent space might also represent a deterioration from from B, the desirable place. And so I sort of liken this to Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. Like the map can only say so much. And so how do we know that that's an adjacent possible on a path to, versus interpreting that as something that is a path from, and something different than where we actually want to go.
That's what we're saying. From a complexity theory point of view, you take a path from, you don't have a path to. Because you've got high levels of uncertainty. So setting an objective always produces perverse incentives. And if you start a journey with a general sense of direction, you're open to novelty on the pathway. So one of the things we do, for example, as an alternative to, we're now focusing, this is a new bit of work we're working on, is measuring alignment of a system, not purpose. Yeah, so we can use the maps to measure whether the system is aligning or not. We don't have to have it top-down driven. We can stimulate the system and see if those clusters are coming together. But there is a human judgment in which direction you want to travel. But the essence of going to an adjacent possible, this is what I call the Frozen 2 strategy. You know, from the song in the middle of that, all I can do is do the next right thing, is move to that stage and look again, because then your goal may change. Yeah, so once you've made that first step, you might decide to go in a different direction or different pathways. And that's, by the way, a key principle of Cynefin. We say any coherent hypotheses about where we should go next. Yeah, and again, term I always acknowledge from Alicia, which is safe to fail experiments, from that paper you wrote on legal systems, Alicia. You want actually parallel safe to fail experiments, because you're not even sure then which is the next step. But all of these steps are coherent. So let's actually look at those and then see where we go next. But that is, I mean, I had this long debate with Mike Jackson. If you want, I can show you my special award for original contribution to systems thinking, which I'm still quite proud of. It was highly ironic when I was given it. But that was one of my points with Mike. You in a complex system, you've got to manage the present, not the future. Yeah, and that as long as you start to define idealistic future states, you reward political gaming, you set aspirational targets people want to achieve, so they get disappointed, and the system won't align because you're choosing one particular pathway. Yeah, so we, for example, use negative stories to define where we don't want to go and leave open possibilities about where we do want to go within those boundaries. So that's using negative stories as a constraint. Yeah.
And Dave, just FYI, on the flight back from Washington, D.C., I got to watch Moana again, and and similar to Frozen 2, the same sentiments of sort of doing the next right thing was reiterated there as well.
I think Disney have got some script writers who know about complexity theory, because there's also the ecological movie, which is really good. I think that's been banned in part of the States now.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Dave, I have a question before anybody else puts their hands up. And you've written about this, but for the group, why estuarine? Why estuaries?
Okay, so I got really fed up with colleagues of mine and associates of mine constantly talking about Bayesian and constructional law, right? And yeah, this is part of my physics. I don't really like thermodynamics that much, but I quite like quantum mechanics. All right, so there's a degree of background prejudice on this, but it's that Enlightenment myth which you see in metamodernism and adult development theory, that everything is always progressing in one direction, and it's all for the greater good. Yes, it's a very Panglossian concept if you look at it, right? And the fact you have to explain Panglossian to people depresses me these days, right? So either way, so that was a linear progression. And I said once in a conversation, to hell, yeah, it's not a bloody river, it's an estuary. The water can go in both directions. Yeah, so the water can go in, the water can go back. You can only cross it at turn of the tide. The brackishness, the salinity of the water tells you something about the characteristics. You've got, granite cliffs, you've got sand cliffs, you've got salt marshes. It's a really good metaphor for an organization, because it's a metaphor of constant change and adaptability, not excessive structure. And it's not all flowing in one direction. So that was the reason. Yeah. And the other thing, this is Deleuzian. You talk about rhizomic systems, not arbitorial systems. All right. And constructional law is arbitorial. Constructor theory is rhizomic.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, because I got a little confused at one point. I was like, is this about the boundary between the river and the ocean? What's happening here?
You never know, and it's constantly changing.
Yeah. Okay.
We decided not to use a Welsh word for it, though. I gave up on that in the end.
How come?
Estuarine is too well established.
All right.
If I wanted to call it a Welsh word, I needed to do it a lot earlier. Added to which I can't get agreement amongst the first Welsh language speakers about what Welsh word I could use. There's a ferocious battle going on between the North Walians and the South Walians about whether one word is valid or not. And if the North Walians start to fight the South Walians, you stay the hell out of it, on that.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, my perspective was that as an American, most of us have no idea what an estuary is, and so you could
loads of them, right?
Of course, there's loads of them. We just don't know what they are. We don't know what they are, and I mean, I wouldn't recognize one if I was standing in it. So there's a level of understanding that comes with
tell a story. It's like Evan, you can tell a story.
Yeah, it's hard when you think you're supposed to know what a word is, as opposed to a Welsh word that you don't know them.
And the Germans objected to it, but then everybody else protested that estuarine did translate into Spanish in Italy, and why was I changing it? So I ended up at this crossroads of angry, indignant people from multiple backgrounds. So I decided not to change anything on the grace that passivity is often the best response to challenge.
Okay, what is you have valid reasons to choose. Okay, considering your Viking ancestors, you have a valid reason to choose the word fjord, says Christian.
That's a really interesting debate in geography. There isn't agreement on whether a fjord is an estuary or not. Yeah, it's a really big issue, all right? And I'm not going there, right? Because if I get geography department sending me evil emails, I'm in real trouble, right? So, I mean, one of the reasons we got lots of words in Wales is we have lots of estuaries because of the massive tidal reach in the Irish Sea. We get 70-foot tidal waves in the Irish Sea at the exit and entries, right? Because of the bottleneck effect. Whereas, Norway is onto the North Sea, so they have fjords and they have, it's not an estuary. The water doesn't go both ways. Yeah. Well, unless you're certain types of geography, you say it sometimes does, but I'm not getting into that one. Yeah. It's not a delta. An estuary is not a delta. That's a good way of explaining it.
I think we actually have a fjord here quite close to where I live here in Sweden, that where the water actually goes both ways.
I know, and that's where it gets really difficult, and that's where geography departments go to war. In geography departments, you're never quite sure how close they are to geoengineering and how they could hit you, all right? Yeah, and have you read Black Opera yet, by the way? It's a great science fiction. It's a wonderful author. She also wrote a book called Mary Gentle. She wrote a book called Grunts, which is Lord of the Rings from the orc's point of view. So it's a story of a lonely orc platoon trying to survive, surrounded by elves and heroes trying to kill them. It's really funny. But Black Opera posits that bel canto opera can create earthquakes if you get the resonance right. So, sorry, I'm going down sidelines. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. Okay, well, that explains a little bit about the whole thing. Although, and just to that point, Dave, your theories have court enough controversy without actually making the language the battleground as well. Okay. So does anyone else have any questions for the group? I would also say before we go that the link to the slides is in the chat in several places. And if you have not grabbed them yet, I would do that as soon as possible. And Yulia?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just right after my international strategic management class, and I always wonder, how do we teach Porter again, or SWOT analysis again, or something like this, when we already know what you have just said? So, do you consider any kind of publication or a book, or just a little small template what not to do and what to do in international strategic management from now on?
We're actually working on that at the moment, right? So one is in the book, and as I say, we'll open up that. We're going to open up a series of workshops over Christmas for people to discuss the book chapters and remind me of things I've forgotten and stuff like that. And I've got a research assistant starting this week who's going to troll through all the blogs and position it. Yeah. So we actually think Estuarine is the foundation for a complexity-based alternative to Porter. Yeah. And that's what we're now looking for investment for, to build the software for that. Because what I want is to bet the ambition, I want grand strategy and tactics to be in the same framework, in the same time area. So in a complex world, you can't afford for a linear relationship between grand strategy and tactics. You need to be the same. Now, we've got the design on that, but that has to be software enabled. And it's a legitimate route of it because you have to work at volume, and that requires software. And that's what we're actually currently looking for investment for, to actually build. Yeah. So that's the next stage. But that will be semiotic in structure, and that's important.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about a marine chart, the marine chart tells you everything you need to know to navigate.
Right.
And that's where we want to go with strategy. So strategy will be charts and patterns, not linear structures, and constantly changing based on real-time observations.
And again, with the small steps, alignment, constraints, and everything that you've mentioned today, as you always do.
So you see an anomaly emerging, right? So you see a ripple on the water to continue it. You don't know whether it's a reef or a sandbank or a whale, right? You just don't know, but you've got a ripple. So you click on that, and then it distributes a question to 1,000 human agents, give her answer in real time. That gives you the patterns of possibility. You can choose where to explore. And then the system creates its own training data set. So as patterns start to develop and you respond, you can have what's called an anticipatory trigger, which says, look at this, something novel is happening, before you would see it conventionally. And so that's what we designed and what we want to start building soon.
And may I ask if your hexagon game might be used as well for strategy creating?
Yeah, it is. So the Hexi kit is now out again. If anybody wants to order it, please order it. We would like some orders in December if possible, please. All right. There's an Estuarine extension pack, which will be announced next week. There are strategy packs and foresight packs also coming out. Okay. And the idea on all of them is that you can deconstruct, not break, existing methods and tools into their lowest coherent components, and then allow them to recombine across vendors and across method structures. So I can take pattern language, for example, from Alexander and from cybernetics from people like Patrick, but I can add a tag to say, basically reduce the granularity. So if you take Patrick Hofstadter's book, and Patrick hates my guts, and I quite like him, but he hates me, all right? And I think it's for this reason, because I keep saying you got some really useful stuff, but I want to break it down more. But he's coming from that cybernetics thing. I've worked out all the patterns. It's always going to be one of these. When actually what you've got is, if you break it down a bit more, you've got something extremely useful, because you can create assemblages of those patterns in different contexts. But I can't persuade him to come out and play on that. Yeah. So I think there's lots of value we can build on, but it's by taking things which have a utility in different methods and putting them together in different combinations. Yeah.
Thank you.
But five forces, by definition, is ordered. Yeah, and Porter is the doyen of systems thinking in terms of strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's going to take a while to move this through the business school.
It didn't. I mean, systems thinking went from wild academic theory to dominant pattern in 3 to 5 years. It's a phase shift change, and we're going through a phase shift change at the moment. Yeah? I mean, the change in human systems doesn't happen gradually; it happens in phase shift.
It'll be an interesting process to watch.
Well, the other point is, I mean, if I'm going to be sarcastic about it, why does American industry adopt the planning horizon of Soviet Russia? Because that's what they're actually doing with Porter, right? And actually, given the way the world is changing at the moment, you will not have time to produce a plan the way it's currently produced and taught in management schools. You will not have the time. Because by the time you produce the plan, everything would have changed anyway. And that's going to be one of the drivers for this. I mean, just to get depressing on this, all right? We're getting the early signs of the next plague at the moment, and that's probably bacteriology. So, we got early deaths on the board in Siberia, which are unexpected. yeah, we're going to have mass heat extinction events in the States and in India over the next 2 to 3 years. Yeah, that is going to change everything in terms of supply chains and everything else. You can't afford to have a linear approach to strategy anymore. You've got to have an adaptive approach based on real-time sensors, and that is going to drive this stuff.
Yeah, well, that was cheerful.
I was in Brazil last week. Rio hit 52 degrees one day. That's 4 degrees short of everybody dying. Yeah, once you reach a certain temperature, the body can't shed heat fast enough and you die. Right? And we're going to get more stuff like that. And that requires a whole different approach. I mean, that's why, you know, we really want to get all the school children in the world capturing stories every week thing going. And again, we're talking about funding on that. Because governments need to have real-time feedback at school district level from their citizens. They can't afford for conventional research anymore. And people are starting to realize that. Michael?
Yes. Oh,
Yeah, Dave, can you speak to where how identity plays into territorialization and deterritorialization?
I would now talk about assemblage rather than identity, I think. Right? So I think, yeah, and I mean, human beings have multiple identities, but I'd now say we live in different assemblages. Assemblages are probably fractal. All right, in the way and in terms of the way they work, they're not nested, but they are fractal. Right. So I would tend to talk these days about an assemblage or use identity as a subset of assemblage. And also because we're heavily emphasizing role combinations now. So stop talking about individuals, but start to talk about combinations of roles. Yeah. Right? Because what's interesting, if you make decisions in role combinations, you suffer less stress than if you make a decision as an individual. And if you can remove stress from decision making, you can increase the efficacy and the courage of decision making. When people are stressed, they just get very conservative. And that's where McKinsey's rely on their business job. Nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report.
So then you're taking obviously a concept of territorialization and deterritorialization as a group dynamic, obviously. But what are the implications at the individual level? Dynamic. Okay. But so are there implications at the individual level?
Individual probably can't do it. One of the big uses of Estuarine mapping, if anybody's interested, we're about to set up a track on this on the Horn, is for individuals for coaching. So I was doing this with one of the biggest bank in Brazil the other day, and they really got it. I love teaching in Brazil. I mean, you can teach for 9 hours and use big words, and they don't object. They want to learn. I mean, you do that in an Anglo-Saxon audience, you're dead, right? But at the end of one of the sessions, we had one of the really senior people. At the end of it said, right, I love this. It's really worked. It's helped me understand strategy. And literally, we trained for a day and a half on Ian's team. And Ian's team, and you know Ian's team then ran it with several of their executives, and it worked. But at the end of it, one of the executives said, I'm going to go away and draw this up for myself tonight. Now, that's something we have started to work on, because if you actually look at your own environment, you say, what are the actors? What are the constraints? What are the constructors? Where do they sit on the energy gradient? How can I move those? You're moving into micro interventions to change something rather than macro. And that changes the discourse between coach and coachee. So there's a separate strand in the Horn which is going to open up to develop that. Justin?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, what you were describing is the term intersectionality, unless you're meaning it kind of differently, where you can recognize that, you know, like as a human, you have different identities, like they're not, you know, just segmented in your brain. You know, you can have your gender identity and your cultural identity and your ethnic identity and your role in your family and all of that. That's what that idea is.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, sorry, one of my bête noirs, and I know you're not saying this, is when people try and pull family therapy theory sideways into organizations. And I have a
general, I'm just meaning more like just, yeah.
But But there are things about families we can understand. So the maximum number of active decision makers in the extended family is 5. Yeah. So actually we will compromise in groups of 5. Right. So and I was doing one the other day. So we had ambulance, we're looking at triage in and out of hospital. So I had ambulance drivers, nurses, consultant surgeons, social workers, all in their tribes arguing with each other, even though they were being very polite about it because they knew they were meant to work together. So that the level of passive aggressive conversation was quite spectacular. And they were all British, and British do passive aggressive better than any other nation in the world. All right. So it was one of those. When we took one person from each of the groups and dumped them in small teams, they came up with novel solutions. Yeah, because they couldn't fall back to their tribes. And that's what we're building on in distributed decision making. You have 5 people with 5 different roles, one of which is anonymous. Then they will find novel solutions because they can't fall back into their tribes. And that's where we can distribute resource allocation. But the minute you go to groups of bigger than 5 or smaller than 3, it breaks down.
Okay, I think I missed like a nuance there where you're talking about like within the group of 5, you have the different roles. And I was thinking almost of like how as a human, you might have 5 different roles in your life or whatever.
Yeah,
but you're almost like, yeah.
You do. And I think human beings have learned how to switch between roles.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the ways we do that is with ritual, and ritual is hugely underestimated in its importance. Yeah, ritual and habit are critical on humans. So ritual changes identity. So it changes the cognitive activation patterns of the brain. So you see things differently. Yeah, that's why it works in operating theatres. So human beings can adopt multiple identities, but they also have the assemblage structures can contain those identities. So give one of my examples on this. When I was in Dallas a few years back, and I was working with the Ebola management teams in the States, I was taken, and this is all medical, I was taken on one side and said, you can't mention evolution because it's a controversial theory. All right. This is the Ebola management teams, and that's significantly scary because Ebola is currently moving into its symbiotic stage where it doesn't kill everybody, which is what happens with viruses, right? But what do you do if you're a medical person with medical training in a culture where the assemblage structure doesn't allow you to talk about core science? Yeah. And do you end up conforming, which is what they were doing, or do you end up disrupting? And I think that's one of the areas which really needs some good research. And that's one of the areas we're trying to look at the moment. And that's where the Children Project come in. Because if children from schools gather stories, we can look at patterns in stories at a micro level. And we can identify where there are commonalities between people with different political backgrounds. And we can start there rather than the macro level differences. So if you can find macro level similarities across political boundaries, you can do a huge amount on peace and reconciliation. If you try and resolve the macro level in the workshop, it always fails. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Any more comments? Alicia, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, thank
you. Dave? No, you're done with that? You're done with us? Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I have a lot to think about. Dave, you have to come back and talk to us about all of this and AI at some point. We didn't really get to that today. And
talking on that this week.
Yeah, so maybe in the new year. And now I feel like we have to have a panel discussion about assemblage theory at some point because it's a lot. Good. Yeah, I think we need to put that together.
Get Ali and Anna in, and they can tell you what you want. They're better at it. People. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put something together. I think because it's a lot, and I think it's clearly important. So we need to get to that. But I mean, if no one else has any questions, I will say, Dave, thank you so much. This is, as always, this was really great. And we'd also like you to know how much we appreciate your support of the lounge. You've always been super supportive and really helpful in organizing this stuff. It means the world to us, and we can't thank you enough. You always have an open invitation, as you know. You can come back anytime and talk about anything you want. For the rest of us, if you're new to the lounge, we hope you come back again. You're always welcome. And to those of you that have been with us before, well, thank you so much for continuing to join us on this ride. I mean, Jocko and I keep plugging away here, and we'll see how it works out. but we also couldn't do it without you. So we're working on some really great programming for 2024. So watch for the announcements. And with that, it's a wrap on 2023. Thank you. Bye, all.